Welcome to the channel Stories to Relax. I'm Bento, and here we take things gently, letting the mind slow down as we dive into fascinating stories told at just the right pace to help you relax, or maybe even drift off to sleep. If you prefer a softer narration, try setting the playback speed to 0.8. It started as a soft whisper, a sound the unforgiving sand had not heard for many long months. The midday sun scorched the skin, the air hung heavy and motionless, and the horizon shimmered under the relentless heat of the Nile Valley. It was the year 3000 before Christ, and this vast territory was not yet the golden cradle of legendary dynasties, but a harsh landscape where survival here remained a daily, terrifying gamble. Then, the miracle arrived. The water did not crash down like a chaotic storm, but advanced like a deep, steady breath of the earth. The river, previously sluggish and low, began to swell with a mysterious, distant power. Where moments before there lay only brown dust and the certainty of starvation, a dark line of fertile silt crept forward, conquering inch by inch, swallowing the dryness. The solitary farmer standing on the bank did not realize it, but he was watching the silent birth of a civilization. Without that rising black tide, there would be no pyramids, no temples, no empire. The ground drank the moisture with the thirst of centuries. Right there on that muddy edge, history decided that mighty Egypt would become eternal. To understand why that solitary farmer watched the river with such reverence, you have to understand the terrifying fragility of his world. Without the Nile, Egypt is not a country, it is a graveyard. To the east and west, the Sahara stretches out as an endless ocean of death, a place where the sun kills without mercy and the wind carries nothing but heat. In that ancient world, if the river failed, the civilization died. It was that simple. But the river did not fail, and that was the greatest mystery of all. For the people living on those banks, the water appeared like magic. They never saw the heavy rains falling on the distant Ethiopian highlands, thousands of miles to the south. They never witnessed the monsoon swelling the Blue Nile, or the steady flow of the White Nile pushing through the wetlands. All they knew was that every year, during the season they called Akhet, the river transformed. It was as if a god had decided to grant them a reprieve from the inevitable dust. This annual rhythm did more than just water the crops. It shaped their entire concept of time and divinity. When you live in a place where survival depends entirely on a predictable natural cycle, nature stops being just scenery and becomes theology. The rising water was not just hydrology to them, it was a promise. It was the chaotic desert being tamed by cosmic order. It turned the act of farming into a religious dialogue. You did not just plant seeds, you participated in a divine resurrection. So, when we look at ancient Egypt, we are not just looking at stone monuments or gold masks. We are looking at a society built around a single hydraulic heartbeat. Every pyramid, every prayer, and every war started with the water level in the valley. They built the longest-lasting civilization in history because they mastered the rhythm of this unique river. Now we are going to step into that world. We will leave the modern map behind and stand in the mud of the delta, watching the first green shoots rise from the black earth. We are going to see how a simple geographical accident created the stage for the greatest human drama of antiquity. To understand the soul of Egypt, you must first understand the impossible journey of its water. It is a journey that begins long before the river ever sees the pyramids or the temples of Luxor. It starts thousands of miles away in a world that looks nothing like the dry sands of the pharaohs. The story of the Nile is actually the story of two different rivers, two distinct personalities that travel across a continent to meet, merge, and create a miracle. The first of these personalities is the White Nile. It is the steady, reliable heartbeat of the system. It rises from the Great Lakes of Central Africa, specifically Lake Victoria, a place of lush greenery, heavy rains, and tropical humidity. Here the water is born in a cradle of life, surrounded by dense vegetation and constant moisture. As it begins its journey north, the White Nile is calm, consistent, and clear. It loses a tremendous amount of its volume as it fights its way through the Sud, a massive chaotic swamp in modern-day South Sudan. The vegetation there is so thick that it almost chokes the river, slowing it down, filtering it, turning it into a sluggish giant. But the White Nile is stubborn. It persists. It pushes through the reeds and the papyrus, carrying with it a steady flow of water that does not depend on the seasons. It is the backbone of the river, the guarantee that even in the worst droughts, the riverbed will never be completely dry. However, if the Nile relied only on this white branch, Egypt would never have become an empire. The flow is too gentle, the volume too low to flood the vast valley to the north. The White Nile provides the water to drink, but it does not provide the soil to farm. For that, nature created the second personality, the Blue Nile. This branch is the volatile, aggressive, and powerful younger brother. It rises in the highlands of Ethiopia from Lake Tana. This is a different world entirely. Here the mountains scrape the sky and the monsoon rains fall with violence. The Blue Nile is not steady. It is seasonal and moody. For most of the year, it is a quiet stream. But when the summer rains hit the Ethiopian peaks, the Blue Nile transforms into a raging monster. It tears down the mountain gorges, carving through the rock with terrifying speed. And as it rushes down, it does something crucial. It erodes the volcanic rock and the dark earth of the highlands. It picks up thousands of tons of black silt, rich, mineral-heavy mud. This is not just dirt. It is fertilizer, manufactured by geology. The Blue Nile carries this treasure like a heavy burden, racing north to deliver it to a land that doesn't yet know it is starving. The meeting of these two rivers, near what is now Khartoum, is one of the great marriages of geography. The calm, clear water of the White Nile meets the dark, silty, rushing water of the Blue Nile. They clash and swirl, eventually merging into a single massive entity. From this point on, they are simply the Nile. Now the united river faces its greatest challenge, the Sahara. For the next 1,000 miles, the river receives not a single drop of rain. No tributaries join it, no clouds shelter it. It flows through one of the harshest deserts on the planet, a landscape of absolute desolation. The sun beats down with an intensity that evaporates the water by the gallon every second. By all the laws of nature, the river should die here. It should be swallowed by the sand and evaporated by the heat. But the momentum from the Ethiopian highlands is too strong. The river carves a path through the stone and sand, a long winding green thread stitching together a continent. Along this path, the river encounters the cataracts. These are 6 distinct sections of rapids, white water, and granite boulders that break the smooth flow of the journey. To a modern engineer, they are obstacles. To the ancient Egyptians, they were divine gates. These rough waters made it impossible to sail continuously from the sea to the south. This meant that for thousands of years, Egypt was naturally protected from invasion from the south. The river itself acted as a fortress wall, guarding the civilization that was growing on its banks. Once the river passes the first cataract at Aswan, it enters the famous Nile Valley. This is the Egypt of our imagination. Here, the river creates a long, narrow oasis. On either side, vast limestone cliffs rise up, acting as walls to this sunken garden. If you were to climb those cliffs and walk just a few hundred yards, you would be in the absolute desert, the Red Land, or Deshret, where nothing lives. But down in the valley on the Black Land, or Kemet, life explodes in chaotic abundance. The contrast is sharp and unforgiving. You can stand with one foot in a lush green field of wheat and the other foot in dry, sterile sand. There is no transition, no grey area. There is only the river and there is the void. Finally, after traveling over 4,000 miles, a distance that defies comprehension for an ancient traveler, the river reaches the north. But the journey does not end with a simple exit into the sea. Instead, the river spreads out. It slows down, tired from its continental trek. It splits into multiple branches, creating a fan-shaped marshland known as the delta. Here, the landscape changes again. The narrow valley opens up into a wide, flat, swampy expanse. The air smells of salt and wet earth. Tall papyrus reeds grow in thick forests, hiding hippopotamuses, crocodiles, and millions of birds. It is a labyrinth of water and land, the final breath of the river before it surrenders to the Mediterranean Sea. The ancient inhabitants looked at this geography and saw logic in the chaos. They saw that the river flowed north, towards the sea, which they considered down. But the wind usually blew from the north to the south, allowing them to sail up the river against the current. It was a perfect highway system designed by the gods. You drifted north with the current, and you sailed south with the wind. This specific geography did more than just provide water. It dictated the mindset of the people. Because the river flowed through a desert, the population was forced to live close to each other. There were no scattered, lonely farms far out in the hinterlands. Everyone lived within sight of the water. This created a society that was densely packed, highly organized, and incredibly unified. They were all neighbors, watching the same river, waiting for the same flood. It is also ironic to think about the orientation of their world. To us, north is up. To them, south was up, because that is where the water came from. They looked south towards the source, towards the life-giving flow. The Mediterranean was the end of the world, the bottom of the drain. The true power lay in the deep south, in those mysterious mountains they would never see, where the gods poured water from invisible jars to feed their children. As the first tribes settled in this valley around 5,000 years ago, they realized they had stumbled upon a biological machine. They didn't need to invent complex irrigation systems or wait for unpredictable rains like their neighbors in Mesopotamia. They just had to wait. The river did the work. The geography was the technology. And so the stage was set. The White Nile provided the permanence. The Blue Nile provided the power and the soil. The desert provided the protection, isolation, and the delta provided the gateway to the wider world. The river had finished its journey. Now it was time for the people to begin theirs. In the modern world, a flood is a disaster. It is something you insure your house against, something that triggers emergency sirens and evacuation orders. We build dams, levees, and concrete walls specifically to stop rivers from misbehaving. But in ancient Egypt, the perspective was entirely different. A flood wasn't a catastrophe, it was a paycheck. In fact, it was the only paycheck that mattered. For the people living along the Nile, the year did not begin in January. It began in mid-July, with the rise of the dog star Sirius. And it began with a paradox. To survive, they needed their world to drown. The months leading up to this event, roughly April, May, and June, were a time of rising anxiety. The land was parched. The river was a thin, sluggish ribbon of green in a wide bed of cracked, dry mud. The heat in the valley during this time is physical. It presses down on your shoulders like a heavy weight. Dust covers everything, the food, the houses, the skin. This was the season of the low Nile, and it was a time of nervousness. If the river stayed low, people starved. If it stayed low for 2 years in a row, dynasties collapsed. So the priests would stand by the riverbanks, chanting prayers and burning incense, trying to convince the god Hapi to be generous. They told the common people, that the flood was caused by the tears of the goddess Isis, weeping for her dead husband Osiris. It was a beautiful story. It was certainly more poetic than monsoon rains hitting the Ethiopian mountains, which was the geological reality. And then the water came. It wasn't the clear blue water you might see in a tourist brochure. The initial surge of the flood was often reddish, stained by the iron-rich soil of Ethiopia. To an observer on the bank, it looked like blood. Then, as it mixed with organic matter, it turned a dark, rich brown. It smelled of wet earth, fish, and vegetation, a heavy, thick scent that meant life was returning. This season was called Akhet, the inundation. It lasted roughly from June to September. During these months, the Nile Valley ceased to be a valley and became a vast, shallow lake. Villages built on high ground became temporary islands, connected only by causeways or boats. For the average farmer, this was a strange time. You might assume that a society based on agriculture would work in the fields all year round. But during Akhet, there were no fields. They were under 6 feet of water. This created a massive surplus of unemployed labor. Here lies the genius, or perhaps the cynicism, of the Egyptian state. What do you do with thousands of strong men who cannot farm for 3 months because their land is underwater? You certainly don't want them sitting around idle, thinking about politics or rebellion. So the pharaoh put them to work. This was the season for the great state projects. When we look at the pyramids or the massive temples of Karnak, we are looking at the result of the flood season. These monuments were built by farmers who were temporarily transformed into construction workers while they waited for the water to recede. It was a brilliantly efficient system. The river fed them, and the downtime built the king's tomb. By late September or October, the waters would begin to recede. This marked the beginning of the second season, Pere, or the season of emergence. This was the most critical time of the year. As the water pulled back, it didn't just leave wet ground. It left a layer of black silt, the famous kemet. This mud was soft, thick, and incredibly nutrient-rich. It was so soft that you didn't need heavy steel plows to break it. Often, farmers would simply scatter seeds on the wet mud and then drive pigs or cattle over the fields to trample the seeds into the soil. It was agriculture on easy mode, provided by the river. However, this period required frantic energy. The mud would eventually dry and harden into concrete-like clay under the sun. The farmers had to work fast. They had to dig canals, repair dikes, and trap as much water as possible in basins before it flowed back into the main channel. It was a race against the evaporation rate. This creates an interesting picture of the Egyptian character. They are often portrayed as obsessed with death and the afterlife, solemn and serious. But their daily life was actually a muddy, energetic wrestle with nature. They were hydraulic engineers by necessity. If you argued with your neighbor, it wasn't usually about religion. It was probably because he blocked your irrigation ditch. The final season was Shemu, the harvest, roughly from March to May. This was when the crops, mostly emmer wheat and barley, were gathered. It was a time of celebration, but also a time of accounting. This brings us to the darker side of the river's gift: taxes. The Egyptian government was arguably the first bureaucracy in history to master the art of forecasting tax revenue based on hydrology. They built structures called nilometers, stone staircases descending into the river with markings on the walls to measure the water level. These devices were scattered along the length of the river. Officials monitored them obsessively. They knew that an ideal flood meant a huge harvest, which meant they could demand higher taxes. A low flood meant they had to lower expectations or risk a revolt. A flood that was too high was also a problem. It could wash away villages and rot the seed. There was a specific sweet spot on the nilometer. If the water hit that mark, the pharaoh smiled, the priests claimed credit. and the tax collectors sharpened their reed pens. It is a supreme irony that the most spiritual event of the year, the arrival of the divine waters, was immediately converted into a mathematical formula for calculating how much grain the government could confiscate. But for the common man, the cycle was simpler. He didn't worry about the grand economics. He worried about the rhythm. His life was not measured by arbitrary weeks or numbered days, but by the color of the river. He knew the river would rise. He knew it would fall, and he knew it would return. This predictability created a deep psychological comfort. In other parts of the ancient world, like Mesopotamia, the rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, were violent and unpredictable. They flooded at the wrong times and destroyed cities. Consequently, Mesopotamian gods were seen as angry and chaotic. But in Egypt, the Nile was reliable. It was punctual. It was a benevolent, if powerful, friend. This reliability allowed the Egyptians to believe that the universe was fundamentally an orderly place, governed by Ma'at, truth, balance, and order. If you lived right, if you respected the cycles, the river would provide. It was a comforting lie, perhaps. Famines did happen, and things did go wrong, but it was a lie that held the civilization together for 3,000 years. So, life in the valley was a dance with the water. You waited for it, you worked with it, you harvested from it, and then you waited again. The river dictated when you worked, when you rested, and when you paid. It was the clock, the calendar, and the boss. And as the sun set over the western cliffs, turning the brown water to gold, even the poorest farmer knew that as long as the river flowed, Egypt would survive. When the water finally retreated in October, it left behind something that looked, to the untrained eye, like a mess. The valley floor was covered in a thick, dark sludge. It smelled pungent, a mixture of decaying fish, soaked vegetation, and wet minerals. If you were a modern tourist, you would probably try to avoid stepping in it. But to an ancient Egyptian, this black muck was more beautiful than gold. In fact, it was more valuable than gold. They called their country Kemet, which literally translates to the Black Land. This wasn't a poetic metaphor about the night sky. It was a literal description of the mud under their feet. This soil was a geological miracle. It had traveled thousands of miles from the volcanic highlands of Ethiopia, breaking down rocks rich in potassium and phosphorus along the way, and then depositing them right at the farmer's doorstep. It was a natural delivery of top-tier fertilizer that arrived on schedule every single year. Imagine the advantage this gave them. In other parts of the ancient world, farming was a brutal war against the soil. You had to slash and burn forests, pull up heavy stones, and exhaust yourself trying to convince the ground to yield a few bushels of grain. And after a few years, the soil would be depleted, forcing you to move on or starve. In Egypt, the river reset the game board every year. The flood brought a fresh layer of nutrients, meaning the land never got tired. You could farm the exact same patch of ground for 3,000 years and get the same bumper crop. It was a cheat code for civilization. The process of farming this sludge was surprisingly low-tech, even for the time. Because the soil was so soft and wet, they didn't need the heavy iron-tipped plows that Europeans would later develop to break up hard clay. The Egyptian plow was a lightweight wooden tool, often little more than a scratched stick pulled by a pair of oxen. Sometimes they didn't even bother with that. There is a wonderful irony in how they planted their seeds. In a society that would eventually produce complex mathematics and engineering precise enough to align pyramids with the stars, the sowing method was throw seeds on the ground and send in the pigs. Farmers would scatter the grain, mostly emmer wheat and barley, directly onto the moist mud. Then they would drive herds of pigs, sheep, or cattle over the field. The animals' hooves would push the seeds down into the wet earth, burying them at the perfect depth to germinate. It was crude, it was messy, but it was incredibly effective. It is humbling to realize that the caloric foundation of the greatest empire of antiquity depended on pigs running through mud. Once the seeds were in, the real magic began. The combination of the nutrient-rich soil and the intense North African sun created a greenhouse effect without the glass. The crops exploded out of the ground. The primary focus was always on grain. Emmer wheat was for bread and barley was for beer. And we need to pause here to appreciate the importance of these two items. In the modern world, bread and beer are just items on a grocery list. In ancient Egypt, they were the currency, the fuel, and the social glue. Bread was the staple. It was baked in every shape imaginable. Flat loaves, conical loaves, sweet breads with honey and dates. But it was gritty. The wind from the desert constantly blew sand into the flour, and the grinding stones added their own rock dust. As a result, the bread slowly ground down the teeth of the population. When archaeologists examine Egyptian mummies today, even the pharaohs often have terrible teeth. It was the price of living in a sandbox. Then there was the beer. This wasn't the filtered carbonated lager we drink today. It was a thick, nutritious, slightly alcoholic porridge-like soup. It was safer to drink than stagnant water, and it provided a massive amount of calories. When the pharaoh built the pyramids, he didn't pay the workers in silver coins. He paid them in rations of bread and jugs of beer. You could argue that the pyramids were essentially built on a foundation of carbohydrates and mild intoxication. But the fertile banks didn't just produce food. They produced the packaging for civilization. Flax grew in abundance along the river edges. This plant was harvested, soaked, beaten, and spun into linen. The Egyptians were obsessed with cleanliness and purity. In a land of dust, heat, and mud, they wanted to be white and pristine. Linen allowed them to do that. It was light, breathable, and could be bleached to a dazzling white. It became a status symbol. The finer the weave, the higher your rank. A peasant wore rough, sack-like linen. A high priest wore linen so sheer it was almost transparent. It is a fascinating contradiction. A culture entirely dependent on black mud for survival, yet obsessed with wearing spotless white cloth. The gardens along the riverbanks also produced a variety of vegetables that would look familiar in a modern kitchen. Onions, garlic, leeks, lentils, chickpeas, lettuce, and cucumbers. Herodotus, the Greek historian, claimed that the builders of the Great Pyramid consumed vast quantities of radishes, onions, and garlic. While we should always take Herodotus with a grain of salt, the idea holds up. These vegetables provided the vitamins needed to keep a workforce standing. There were also fruits, dates from the palms that lined the canals, figs, grapes for wine, though wine was mostly a drink for the elite while beer was for the people, and pomegranates. However, the true power of the Nile's fertility wasn't just that it provided enough food to eat. It was that it provided more than enough. This is the secret key to Egyptian history: surplus. Because the land was so fertile, a single farmer could produce much more food than his family needed to survive. In many other ancient societies, 90% of the population had to farm just to keep everyone alive. In Egypt, the ratio was better. The land was so generous that it freed up a significant portion of the population to do other things. If you don't have to spend every waking hour hunting for food, you have time to think. You have time to specialize. You can become a potter, a weaver, a scribe, a priest, or a soldier. You can cut stone, you can study the stars. This surplus is what allowed the state to exist. The government's main job was to collect this extra grain, store it in massive granaries, and then redistribute it to feed the people who weren't farming: the army, the priesthood, and the builders. The majestic temples of Luxor and the sprawling complex of Karnak are, in economic terms, just crystallized surplus grain. They are what happens when you have too much bread and plenty of time. But this abundance also created a vulnerability. The people became specialized and dependent on the system. A farmer in a small village might know how to grow wheat, but he relied on the state to manage the canals, protect the storage, and distribute the tools. And the state relied on the river. If the Nile failed to rise, a low flood, the disaster was immediate. The surplus would vanish, the granaries would empty, and suddenly all those specialized workers, the stone cutters, the artists, the priests, were just extra mouths to feed. Chaos would ensue. There were periods in Egyptian history known as intermediate periods, where the central government collapsed, often triggered by a series of bad floods. In these times, the beautiful order of the Black Land dissolved into civil war and starvation. But for most of the 3,000 years of their history, the system worked. The mud arrived, the pigs trampled the seeds, the grain rose, and the civilization flourished. Walking through an Egyptian field during the harvest season must have been an assault on the senses. The sound of sickles cutting the dry stalks, the chanting of the workers, who often sang to keep the rhythm, the dust of the threshing floor, the smell of roasting geese and baking bread wafting from the village ovens. It was a scene of intense, vibrant life, hemmed in on both sides by the silent, dead desert. It was a narrow strip of green, usually no more than 10 or 12 miles wide, winding through a wasteland. But within that strip, the earth was so alive it seemed to vibrate. The ancient Egyptians looked at this and concluded that they were the chosen people, living in the center of the world, blessed by gods who loved them. And looking at the black soil that gave them everything for free, it is hard to argue with their logic. Time is usually something we think of as abstract. We measure it in seconds, minutes, and hours, arbitrary slices of eternity that we track on glowing screens or mechanical dials. But for the ancient Egyptians, time was not a concept. It was a physical reality. It was wet, it was heavy, and it determined whether you lived or died. While we divide our year into 4 seasons based on the tilt of the earth and the temperature of the air, the Egyptians ignored that logic completely. They didn't care about spring or autumn. Those were irrelevant concepts in a land where it was generally sunny and hot all year round. Instead, they divided their year into 3 distinct seasons, and all 3 were defined exclusively by the behavior of the Nile. Their calendar was not solar, and it was not lunar. It was hydraulic. The year began with Akhet, the season of inundation. This is where the Egyptian concept of a new year differs radically from ours. For us, the new year is a midnight countdown and a glass of champagne. For an ancient Egyptian farmer, the new year arrived when his front yard disappeared under 3 feet of water. It started in mid-July, heralded by a cosmic coincidence that the priests loved to point out. Just as the river began to swell, the brightest star in the sky, Sirius, known to them as Sothis, would reappear on the horizon just before dawn after being invisible for 70 days. To the Egyptians, this wasn't astrophysics, it was a signal. The star was the watchdog, barking to announce that the flood was coming. During Akhet, which lasted roughly from mid-July to mid-November, the agricultural world stopped. The valley held its breath. This was a time of suspended animation for the land. As we discussed, this was when the farmers transformed into builders. It was a season of logistics, waiting, and stockpiling. Then came Peré, the season of emergence. Around mid-November, the waters would recede, leaving the land glistening and black. This was the Egyptian spring, though it happened during what we would call winter. The name Peré literally means coming forth, referring to the land coming forth from the water and the green shoots coming forth from the land. This was the season of frantic activity. The calendar demanded speed, the soil was wet, and the clock was ticking on the moisture. Farmers had to plow or let the pigs do it, and sow immediately. The weather during Pere was actually pleasant, cooler, less brutal than the summer heat. It was the growing season. Finally, there was Shemu, the season of harvest. Starting around mid-March and running until July, this was the dry season. The water was gone, the river was low, and the sun was reclaiming the desert. The crops had to be harvested, threshed, and stored before the heat became unbearable or the pests took over. This cycle, flood, growth, drought, was so ingrained in their psyche that their word for year, renpet, was written with a hieroglyph depicting a palm shoot, symbolizing the renewal of life. But here is where the story gets interesting, and where the Egyptian genius for bureaucracy clashed with the messy reality of nature. The Egyptians were obsessed with order, ma'at. They wanted everything to be neat, divisible, and perfect. So they designed a civil calendar that was mathematically beautiful. They decided that each of the 3 seasons, Akhet, Peret, Shemu, would have exactly 4 months, and they decided that each month would have exactly 30 days. 3 seasons times 4 months times 30 days equals 360 days. It was a perfect round number, a circle. The only problem, of course, is that the solar year, the time it takes the Earth to go around the Sun, is not 360 days. It is 365 and a quarter days. Any farmer could tell you that the calendar was 5 days short. If they kept strictly to the 360-day calendar, the seasons would drift. Eventually, Akhet, the flood season, would be falling in the middle of the dry summer, and the calendar would become a useless joke. So the priests and scribes came up with a solution that feels like a clumsy patch on a piece of software. They added 5 extra days at the end of the year. They didn't belong to any month. They didn't belong to any season. They were the days upon the year, the epagomenal days. These 5 days were considered dangerous, magical, and chaotic. They were outside of time. Mythology stepped in to explain why they existed. The story went that the sky goddess Nut was pregnant, but the sun god Ra forbade her from giving birth on any day of the year. So the god of wisdom, Thoth, played a board game with the moon and won enough light to create 5 extra days that were not part of the year. Nut used these 5 days to give birth to her children, Osiris, Horus, Set, Isis, and Nephthys. For the common people, these 5 days were a time of superstition. You didn't do important business on these days. You didn't start a journey. You prayed, you celebrated the birthdays of the gods, and you hoped the world wouldn't fall apart before the new year reset the clock. However, even with the 5 extra days, the Egyptian year was still a quarter of a day shorter than the true solar year. They didn't account for the leap year. This meant that every 4 years their calendar fell 1 day behind nature. It doesn't sound like much, but over centuries it was a disaster. The official first day of the flood would slowly drift backward through the seasons. It would take 1,460 years, a Sothic cycle, for the calendar to realign with the stars and the river perfectly again. This created a fascinating dual reality in Egypt. On one hand, you had the scribes and the bureaucrats in the temples. They maintained the civil calendar. They wrote dates on documents, recorded reigns of kings and scheduled festivals based on this mathematical, slightly flawed system. They knew it was drifting, but they valued the mathematical purity of the 30-day month more than the messy reality. On the other hand, you had the farmers. They couldn't care less what the scribe wrote on a piece of papyrus. If the calendar said it was the season of harvest, but the river was rising and flooding the fields, the farmer wasn't going to go out and try to harvest underwater wheat just because the paperwork said so. The farmers lived by the natural calendar. They watched the river, not the date. They watched the birds migrating. They watched the color of the water. This disconnect illustrates something profound about the Egyptian worldview. They were a people suspended between two powerful forces: the rigid, unchanging order they wanted, the perfect calendar, and the cyclical, organic chaos of nature they needed, the actual river. Their entire society was an attempt to reconcile these two. They built stone temples that would never change to honor a river that changed every day. They invented a rigid calendar to track a fluid event. And perhaps the greatest irony is that this system, with its drifting days and its reliance on mud, created the most stable timeline in human history. While other civilizations rose and fell, tearing up their calendars and starting over with every new conqueror, the Egyptian farmer kept to his rhythm: flood, plant, harvest, flood, plant, harvest. It was a rhythm that beat steadily for 3 millennia. Kings could die, dynasties could fall, and invaders could come with their strange gods and new weapons. But no one could stop the Nile from rising in Akhet, and as long as the river rose, the calendar of the soil remained the only law that truly mattered. To understand how the first villages appeared along the Nile, we have to start by looking away from the river. We have to look at the desert, because that is where the story actually begins. About 7,000 years ago, the Sahara was not the endless ocean of sand we see today. It was a green savanna. It had lakes, giraffes, hippos, and scattered tribes of humans who hunted and gathered across the plains. It was a good life, expansive and free. But then the climate began to shift. The rains stopped coming. The lakes evaporated into salt pans. The grass withered and turned to dust. This climate change triggered one of the greatest refugee crises in prehistory. Thousands of people were slowly pushed inward, migrating toward the only reliable source of water left in North Africa, the Nile Valley. They didn't come to the river because they wanted to build an empire. They came because they were thirsty. It was a migration driven by pure survival. When these diverse groups arrived at the banks of the river, they faced a new reality. In the open savanna, you could wander alone or in small family units. If you didn't like your neighbor, you just walked 10 miles in the other direction. But the Nile Valley is a narrow strip of land, hemmed in by unforgiving cliffs. Space was limited. You couldn't just wander anymore. You had to stop, and you had to stand close to your neighbor. This forced proximity was the catalyst for civilization. The first settlements were humble. They were not the grand cities of marble and gold that we see in Hollywood movies. They were clusters of huts built from the only material that was abundant: mud and reeds. They developed a construction technique known as wattle and daub. They would weave walls out of stiff reeds or papyrus stalks, the wattle, and then plaster them with the thick, sticky river mud, the daub. When the sun baked this mixture, it became surprisingly hard. These huts were small, usually one room, with a thatched roof to keep out the sun. There is a profound irony in Egyptian architecture that starts here. The ancient Egyptians made a clear distinction between the houses of the living and the houses of the dead. They believed that life on earth was temporary, a short picnic before eternity. Therefore their homes, even the palaces of the pharaohs later on, were built of mud brick. They were meant to crumble. They were biodegradable. That is why we have almost no physical remains of ancient Egyptian cities or villages today. They literally melted back into the earth. On the other hand, the houses of the dead, the tombs and temples, were built for eternity. They were built of stone. They invested their best engineering and their hardest materials into the places where they would sleep after they died. They lived in mud so they could rest in granite. But back in these early villages, known as the pre-dynastic period, life was entirely about the mud. Living together in these tight clusters changed human behavior. For the first time, agriculture wasn't just an option. It was a necessity, and agriculture on the Nile requires cooperation. You cannot irrigate a field by yourself. If you dig a ditch to bring water to your plot, it affects the plot next door. If the river rises too high and threatens to break the dike, you cannot fix it alone. You need the whole village to come out with baskets of earth to plug the breach. This hydraulic reality created a social contract. I will help you protect your field, because if I don't, the water will flood my field too. It was a system of mutual insurance enforced by geography. However, cooperation eventually breeds hierarchy. When you have 50 men digging a canal, someone needs to decide where the canal goes. Someone needs to decide who digs and who carries the water. Someone needs to settle the dispute when two farmers claim the same patch of fertile silt. From this need, the first headmen or local chieftains emerged. These weren't kings yet. They were likely just the most charismatic, strong, or wealthy individuals in the village who could organize the labor. They were the early managers of the flood. Slowly, these villages began to develop distinct identities. They adopted totems, symbols of animals or objects that represented their clan. One village might march under the standard of the falcon, another under the jackal, another under the scorpion. These weren't just logos. They were the ancestors of the Egyptian gods. The local spirit of the village would eventually evolve into the great deities of the Egyptian pantheon. As the centuries passed, these villages grew larger. They built walls around themselves, not necessarily to keep out foreign invaders, but to protect themselves from the village 5 miles down the river. Competition for the best land was fierce. The settlements became nomes, administrative districts that would persist throughout Egyptian history. Each nome was like a microstate, with its own capital, its own local god, and its own local ruler, the nomarch. Life in these early riverine villages was intense and sensory. Imagine the smell, the smoke of cooking fires burning animal dung. Fuel was scarce. The scent of roasting fish, the ever-present odor of wet mud and livestock. It was noisy, crowded, and busy. They began to specialize. In a nomadic tribe, everyone does everything. In a settled village, you could have a man who was terrible at farming, but excellent at making pottery. So, he made pots for the grain, and the farmers gave him food in exchange. You had women who specialized in weaving linen. You had people who learned to knap flint into razor-sharp knives. Trade began to flow up and down the river. A boatman could carry obsidian from the south, or shells from the Red Sea. The river became a highway, connecting these isolated mud brick islands into a network of commerce. But perhaps the most significant change was psychological. For the first time, humans had a permanent address. They buried their ancestors under the floors of their houses or in cemeteries just outside the village walls. They were literally standing on the bones of their grandfathers. This created a deep sense of continuity and tradition. When you wander the desert, the landscape changes every day. When you live in a Nile village, you see the same sun rise over the same cliff every morning for your entire life. You see the river do the exact same thing your father saw and your grandfather saw. This stability is what allowed the Egyptian culture to bake into its distinct form. The conservatism of Egypt, their love for doing things exactly as they had always been done, was born in these mud villages. If the old way worked to keep the flood from destroying the house, why change it? Innovation was a risk. Tradition was survival. By the year 3500 BC, the banks of the Nile were dotted with these buzzing hives of humanity. They were no longer refugees from the savannah. They were Egyptians. They had tamed the mud, they had organized the labor, and they had created a society. But a village is not a kingdom. These scattered settlements were still rivals, fighting over water and boundaries. The stage was set for something bigger. The falcon wanted to dominate the scorpion. The south wanted to control the north. The river connected them, but it hadn't unified them yet. That unification would require war, blood, and the rise of a figure who was more than just a village headman. It would require a king. But the foundation of that future majesty was laid here, in the humble, crumbling mud huts where the first farmers decided that, despite the floods and the heat, this was a place worth staying. To the modern mind, a river is a geographical feature. It is a collection of hydrogen and oxygen molecules flowing downhill due to gravity. We map it, we dam it, and we analyze its pollution levels. But to an ancient Egyptian, looking at the Nile was not like looking at a body of water. It was like looking at the face of God. Religion for the Egyptians was not something abstract or distant. It was not written in a holy book that you read once a week. Religion was the explanation for what they saw out of their windows every morning, and what they saw was a miracle that defied explanation, a river that rose from nowhere, conquered the desert, and birthed life from death. Consequently, the Nile became the central spine of their entire mythology. It was the theological ink in which their stories were written. It starts with the creation of the world itself. In the beginning, according to the Egyptian worldview, there was only none. This was the primordial ocean, a dark, swirling, chaotic abyss of endless water. It was silent, formless, and infinite. This concept wasn't just a wild guess by a priest. It was a direct observation of the Nile flood. During the inundation, when the valley was covered in water, the world looked exactly like Nun. It was a chaotic, watery void. Then, the myth says, a primeval mound of earth rose out of the water. This was the Benben. Upon this mound, the creator god, Atum or Ra, depending on the city, stood and began the work of organizing the universe. This creation story is literally a description of the receding flood. Every year, the Egyptian farmer watched the waters pull back, revealing the first mounds of wet, fertile mud. Life immediately sprang from these mounds: frogs, insects, plants. To the Egyptians, creation wasn't a one-time event that happened billions of years ago. Creation happened every September. The receding of the Nile was a yearly reenactment of the birth of the universe. But the river had a more personal face than just abstract chaos. That face was Hapi. Hapi was the personification of the inundation itself. He was a fascinating deity because he didn't look like the other gods. He wasn't a majestic falcon or a fierce lion. Hapi was depicted as a man with a significant pot-belly and pendulous breasts. To us, this might look strange, perhaps even comical, but to the Egyptians, it was the ultimate compliment. A skinny god is of no use to a farmer. A skinny god implies famine. Hapi was fat because he was abundant. He represented the richness of the silt, the fullness of the harvest, and the fertility of the land. He was often shown with blue or green skin, representing the water and the vegetation. Interestingly, Hapi had no major temples. There was no great temple of Hapi like the ones for Amun or Horus. Why? Because you don't need to build a house for a god who lives in the water. The river was his temple. Every time the water rose, Hapi was present. The people threw offerings, gold, food, even amulets, directly into the swirling brown currents to appease him. They knew that Hapi was moody. If he was too generous, he destroyed the villages. If he was stingy, the people starved. He was a god who demanded constant respect because he held the keys to the pantry. However, the deepest connection between the river and religion is found in the myth of Osiris. This is the most famous and important story in Egyptian mythology, and it is essentially an agricultural allegory. The story goes that Osiris was a wise and good king who ruled Egypt in a golden age. He was murdered by his jealous brother, Set. Set represents the desert. He is the red land, chaotic, sterile, and dry. He is the storm and the heat. Osiris represents the fertile land. He is the black land, productive, life-giving, and civilized. Set killed Osiris and threw his body into the Nile. Later, Set chopped the body into 14 pieces and scattered them across the land. Isis, the wife of Osiris, traveled the country to gather the pieces, except for one rather crucial part that was eaten by a fish, adding a layer of tragic irony to the tale. She used her magic to reassemble him and breathe life back into him, allowing him to become the lord of the underworld. This myth is the cycle of the Nile disguised as a drama. Osiris dies, the river level drops, the vegetation dies. Set triumphs, the desert heat scorches the land. Isis finds the body and restores him. The flood returns, bringing life back to the soil. Osiris is resurrected, the crops grow again. When an Egyptian saw the green shoots of wheat rising from the dead mud, they were seeing the resurrection of Osiris. The river was the fluid that carried his life force. In fact, the floodwaters were often called the fluids of Osiris. The grain itself was his body. When they harvested the wheat and threshed it, they were, in a ritual sense, participating in the sacrifice of the god to feed the people. It is a beautiful, cyclical promise. Death is not the end. Just as the river always returns and the sun always rises, life will always emerge from death. This belief is why the Egyptians were so obsessed with mummification. They wanted to be like Osiris. They wanted to preserve their bodies so they could join the eternal cycle. But the river wasn't just about life. It was also about danger. And for that they had Sobek. Sobek was the crocodile god. If Hapi was the generous provider, Sobek was the ruthless enforcer. The Nile crocodiles were massive, prehistoric killing machines that infested the waters. They were a constant, terrifying threat to anyone washing clothes or fishing near the banks. In a typical display of ancient logic, the Egyptians didn't just fear the crocodiles, they worshipped them. The logic was pragmatic. If I pray to the boss of the crocodiles, maybe he will tell his children not to eat me today. In cities like Kom Ombo, they kept live crocodiles in pools within the temple. They fed them prime cuts of meat and adorned them with gold jewelry. It must have been a tense job being the priest assigned to put a gold necklace on a 20-foot reptile, but it was a necessary service to keep the waters safe. The Nile also shaped the Egyptian view of the afterlife. To the Egyptians, the afterlife was not a nebulous place in the clouds. It was a physical place called the Field of Reeds, Aru, and it looked exactly like the Nile Valley, only better. In this paradise, the wheat grew 7 cubits high, the canals were always full and there were no taxes. But to get there you had to travel. And since the Egyptians were river people, travel meant a boat. Death was viewed as a river crossing. The sun god Ra traveled across the sky every day in a solar bark, a boat. At night he traveled through the underworld on another boat, fighting the serpent of chaos, Apophis. When a pharaoh died, he was often buried with a real, full-sized wooden ship, dismantled and placed in a pit next to his pyramid. These solar boats were vehicles for the soul to navigate the celestial waters. Even the poor, who couldn't afford a wooden ship, were buried with small clay models of boats. The message was clear. If you want to reach paradise, you're going to need to row. The universe is an ocean, and existence is a voyage. Finally, there is the god Khnum. Khnum was depicted with the head of a ram, and he was the potter god. The myth states that Khnum created human beings on a potter's wheel. And what material did he use? He didn't use light or fire or dust. He used Nile clay. He scooped up the mud from the riverbank, spun his wheel and molded humans into existence, placing them into the wombs of mothers. It is a perfect metaphor. The Egyptians knew that their civilization was made of mud. Their houses were mud. Their pots were mud. Their fields were mud. It made perfect sense that they too were made of the same sacred earth, shaped by the waters of the river. So, the Nile was not just a resource. It was the stage, the actor, and the script of their spiritual life. It taught them that chaos, the flood, could lead to order, the harvest. It taught them that death, drought, was always followed by rebirth, inundation. It gave them a god to love, Osiris, a god to thank, Hapi, and a god to fear, Sobek. While other cultures looked at the stars and felt small, the Egyptian looked at his river and felt connected. He knew exactly where he came from, the mud, and he knew exactly where he was going. To a boat, sailing on an eternal river, toward a field of reeds that would never dry up. If you wanted to travel from one city to another in most parts of the ancient world, you had to walk. You had to strap sandals on your feet, pack a bag and prepare for days or weeks of misery. You faced bandits, wild animals, blistering heat, and the sheer physical exhaustion of dragging your own body weight across rough terrain. Land travel was a punishment. But in Egypt, travel was adrift. The Nile was not just a source of water, it was a pre-built, frictionless superhighway that ran exactly where everyone lived. It was the central artery of the civilization, solving the problem of logistics before the rest of the world had even figured out good roads. The genius of the Egyptian transport system lay in a remarkably lucky geographical accident. We have touched on this before, but it is worth examining the mechanics because they are the reason Egypt became a unified state. The river flows from the south to the north, pushed by gravity towards the Mediterranean Sea. However, the prevailing winds, the steady Etesian winds, blow almost constantly from the north to the south. This created a perpetual motion machine for the ancient sailor. If you wanted to go north downstream, you simply furled your sail, put away your oars, and let the current carry you. You could literally sleep while the river did the work. If you wanted to go south, upstream, you raised a large square sail, caught the wind, and let the breeze push you against the current. It was effortless, it was elegant, and it meant that trade in Egypt was cheap. In other civilizations, moving heavy goods was a nightmare. To move a ton of grain 50 miles by land required ox carts, drivers, and fodder for the animals, who would eat half the grain they were hauling. To move that same ton of grain on the Nile required a simple barge and a breeze. This efficiency meant that a farmer in the south could easily trade with a potter in the north. It knitted the long, thin country into a single economic zone. The first vessels to ply these waters were not majestic wooden ships. They were humble skiffs made of papyrus. The papyrus plant grew in thick, chaotic forests along the riverbanks, especially in the delta. The Egyptians harvested these tall, triangular reeds and bound them tightly together into bundles. By lashing these bundles together, they created a boat that looked a bit like a floating basket. These reed boats were buoyant and easy to build. You didn't need a saw or a carpenter, you just needed strong hands and a lot of rope. However, they had a significant flaw. They acted like sponges. Over time, the reeds would absorb water, and the boat would become waterlogged and heavy. A papyrus boat had an expiration date. It was a disposable vehicle for a disposable age. As the ambition of the Egyptians grew, so did their need for better ships. They wanted to move massive stones, huge obelisks, and armies. Reed bundles wouldn't cut it. They needed wood. And here lies the great irony of Egyptian engineering. They were the master builders of the ancient world, yet they had almost no building materials for their ships. The native trees of Egypt, the acacia and the sycamore, are gnarled, twisted, and short. You cannot cut a long, straight plank out of an acacia tree. It is good for making charcoal or small furniture, but it is useless for a keel. So, Egypt became the world's first great importer of timber. They looked north to the coast of the Levant, specifically to modern-day Lebanon. There on the mountain slopes grew the majestic cedar trees, tall, straight, and smelling of resin. The trade route to Byblos in Lebanon became one of the oldest and most vital commercial arteries in human history. Egyptian gold and linen went north, cedar logs came south. It is amusing to think that the famous solar barks buried next to the pyramids, the ships meant to carry the pharaoh's soul for eternity, were essentially foreign luxury imports. With these new wooden ships, the river transformed into a bustling marketplace. Imagine standing on the bank of the Nile in the year 3000 BC. The silence of the desert is broken by the constant activity on the water. You would see heavy barges piled high with grain sacks, sitting low in the water, heading north to the royal storehouses. You would see swift skiffs carrying messengers or tax collectors, darting between the slower traffic. You might see a floating cattle drive, cows being transported on wide decks from one pasture to another. There was no currency yet, no coins clinking in pockets. This was a barter economy, but it was a sophisticated one. They used a standard unit of value called the daben, which was a specific weight of copper or silver. A trader might arrive at a village dock with a boatload of dried fish. He wants linen cloth. The village weaver offers the cloth. They don't exchange metal, but they calculate the value. This sack of fish is worth 2 daben. Your cloth is worth 2 daben. Deal. The daben was the imaginary dollar of the Bronze Age, allowing complex trade without the need for minting coins. This river trade allowed for specialization on a national scale. A village near a quarry could stop farming entirely and focus on cutting stone, knowing they could trade the stone for food brought by boat. A town near the gold mines of the eastern desert could focus on mining, trading the gold for beer and bread. The river allowed the body of Egypt to have different organs, all fed by the same circulatory system. But the most impressive feat of river transport was the movement of the megaliths. When we look at the massive granite obelisk standing in Luxor, or the blocks of the Great Pyramid, we are looking at millions of tons of rock that had to be moved hundreds of miles. The granite came from Aswan, way in the south. The pyramids are in Giza, way in the north. How did they do it? They certainly didn't drag them on sledges for 500 miles. They waited for the flood. During the inundation season, Akhet, the water level rose, allowing deep draft barges to sail right up to the edge of the quarries. They would load a 1,000-ton obelisk onto a massive reinforced barge. Then, they would simply float it down the river. When they reached the construction site, they would wait for the water to get close to the pyramid, unload the stone, and then drag it the final short distance. The river did the heavy lifting. The flood was not just for farming. It was the hydraulic crane of the pharaohs. This ease of transport also explains why the Egyptians were so slow to adopt the wheel. We often think of the wheel as the hallmark of civilization. The Egyptians knew about wheels. They used them on pottery turntables and later on chariots, but for transport, they didn't bother with them for centuries. Why would you invest in building expensive roads and unstable wheeled carts when you have a free, smooth, self-moving highway right outside your door? The wheel was unnecessary technology in a hydraulic world. It was like trying to sell a bicycle to someone who already owns a teleporter. However, this connectivity had a political consequence. Because every major city was on the river, it was very hard to hide from the government. In a mountainous country like Greece, a city could isolate itself and become independent. In Egypt, if a city rebelled, the pharaoh could simply sail an army to their doorstep in a few days. The river made it easy to project power. It made it easy to tax. It made it easy to police. The Nile created the perfect environment for a centralized, absolute monarchy. The river bound the people together, whether they liked it or not. So as the sun set over the limestone cliffs, casting long shadows across the water, the Nile was alive with the creaking of oars and the flapping of sails. It was carrying the lifeblood of a young empire: gold from the desert, grain from the delta, stone from the cataracts, and the ideas that would shape the ancient world. The isolated villages we spoke of earlier were no longer isolated. They were stops on a line, nodes in a network. And soon one man would rise up to seize this network, realizing that whoever controlled the flow of the river controlled the destiny of the world. If you were to stand on the banks of the Nile in the year 3500 BC, the sound you would hear would not be the creaking of timber or the snapping of canvas sails. It would be a dry, rhythmic rustling. It was the sound of the wind moving through millions of papyrus stalks, a vast green ocean that lined the river's edge. This plant, Cyperus papyrus, was the Swiss Army knife of the ancient Egyptian world. We usually remember it because they flattened it to make the first paper, giving us the word paper itself. But long before they wrote on it, they sailed on it. The invention of the papyrus boat is a perfect example of human ingenuity born from scarcity. As we have noted, Egypt had no good wood. The local acacia trees were thorny, twisted and stubborn. Trying to make a long plank out of an acacia is like trying to straighten a pretzel. But they had the papyrus. It grew in thick, chaotic forests in the marshes, reaching heights of 10 or 15 feet. The stalk was triangular, tough on the outside, and filled with a spongy, air-filled pith on the inside. That spongy interior was the secret. It was naturally buoyant. It wanted to float. The construction of these first vessels was not carpentry. It was weaving. It was closer to basketry than to shipbuilding. The process began with the harvest, a brutal task in the heat of the swamps. Men would wade into the shallow water, cutting the thick stalks while keeping a nervous eye out for crocodiles, who treated the papyrus thickets as their personal hunting blinds. Once harvested, the stalks were dried slightly to prevent rot, then bundled together. This was a community effort. You couldn't build a boat alone because you needed tension. One group of men would hold the thick bundle of reeds, while another group pulled the ropes tight, lashing them at regular intervals. The shape they created was iconic. Because the reeds were stiff, you couldn't bend them abruptly. You had to curve them gently. This resulted in that famous silhouette we see in hieroglyphs, a crescent moon shape with the prow and the stern curving high up out of the water. This wasn't just an aesthetic choice, it was engineering. The high curved prow allowed the boat to slide over the floating vegetation and sandbanks without getting stuck. It was designed to glide over obstacles, not cut through them. These skiffs were lightweight. A single fisherman could carry his boat on his back like a massive backpack. If he reached a cataract or a shallow stretch, he simply picked up his vessel, walked around the obstacle, and put it back in the water. It was the ultimate portable technology. But there was a catch. There is always a catch. The papyrus boat had a fatal flaw. It was essentially a sponge. When you first put a new skiff in the water, it sat high and proud, dancing on the surface. It was fast and responsive, but immediately the clock started ticking. The cellular structure of the reeds would slowly, inevitably, begin to absorb water. Day by day, the boat would get heavier. It would sit lower in the water. The responsive handling would turn sluggish. After a few weeks or perhaps a month of daily use, the boat would become waterlogged. It wouldn't sink like a stone, but it would become uselessly heavy, submerged to the gunnels. This created a fascinating cycle of disposability. A boat wasn't an heirloom you passed down to your son. It was a seasonal tool, like a pair of sandals. When your boat became too heavy, you dragged it onto the bank, let it dry out, which rarely worked perfectly, or simply repurposed the old reeds as fuel for the fire and built a new one. The Egyptians lived in a world of permanent stone monuments, but their daily mobility relied on biodegradable temporary vessels. Despite this limitation, These fragile boats were the vehicles of daily life. This creates a vivid image of the ancient river traffic. Imagine the fisherman's morning. He pushes his light skiff off the mud at dawn. He stands near the back, never sitting, balancing with the natural grace of someone who grew up on the water. He uses a long pole to punt the boat through the shallows. It is silent. A wooden boat creaks. A papyrus boat whispers. He can glide right up to a flock of ducks or a school of fish without making a sound. But the marshes were not a playground. They were a danger zone. The papyrus thickets were symbols of the wild, untamed world. In Egyptian mythology, the marshes represented the chaos that existed before creation, and living in that chaos was the hippopotamus. To us, the hippo is a rotund, slightly funny animal seen in zoos. To an ancient Egyptian in a reed boat, the hippo was a monster. A male hippo can weigh 3,000 pounds and move with terrifying speed. A papyrus skiff weighs perhaps 50 pounds. If a hippo decided he didn't like you, he didn't just attack you. He snapped your boat in half like a twig. There are tomb paintings showing nobles hunting hippos from these skiffs. They are depicted standing tall and heroic, harpoon in hand. But look closely at the scene. The boat is tiny. The water is full of beasts. This wasn't sport hunting. This was an extreme adrenaline pursuit. It was a display of dominance over chaos. The message was clear. I am so powerful that I can stand on a bundle of grass and kill the monster of the deep. This fragility of the boat also seeped into their religion. The most famous story involving a papyrus boat is the myth of Isis and Horus. When Osiris was murdered by his brother Set, Isis had to hide her baby, Horus, from his murderous uncle. She didn't hide him in a fortress or a palace. She hid him in the papyrus swamps of the Nile Delta. The dense thickets protected the god-king. The soft reeds cradled him. In this context, the papyrus environment was a womb. It was a place of concealment and gestation. Later, when the Hebrew Bible tells the story of Moses being hidden in a basket of bulrushes, reeds among the riverbanks, it is echoing this ancient Egyptian motif. The reed boat is the vessel of salvation for the vulnerable hero. Even the sun god, Ra, traveled in a boat. The Egyptians believed the sky was a celestial ocean. Therefore, the sun wasn't a ball of fire rolling across a dome. It was a passenger on the man-jet, the boat of millions of years. Interestingly, even when the Egyptians eventually began importing cedar wood to build massive ships, they couldn't let go of the old shape. They built their wooden ships to look like papyrus boats. If you look at the famous wooden solar boat found buried beside the Great Pyramid of Khufu, a masterpiece of carpentry 140 feet long, you will see that the stern and the prow curve inward, ending in stylized shapes that look exactly like bound bundles of reeds. It is a classic example of skeuomorphism, when a new design retains ornamental features from the old material. Just as we have a shutter sound on our digital cameras that have no mechanical shutter, the Egyptians put papyrus bundles on their wooden ships. They trusted the shape. It was the shape that had carried their ancestors. It was the shape that worked. As the centuries passed, the papyrus skiff was relegated to the lower classes. The pharaohs and the merchants moved to cedar barges and warships, but in the rural villages in the backwaters of the delta, the tradition continued. The peasant continued to cut the stalks. He continued to bind the ropes. He continued to push his silent crescent-shaped basket out into the morning mist. He knew his boat would eventually rot and sink. He knew he was floating on nothing more than dried grass and air. But he also knew that for a few weeks, he was free. He could drift with the current, lighter than the water, carried by the same plant that gave his civilization its paper, its sandals, and its identity. The papyrus boat was humble, temporary, and fragile, but without it, the Egyptians would have never learned to walk on water, To walk along the banks of the Nile in ancient times was to walk through a crowded, noisy, and dangerous biological cathedral. We often picture ancient Egypt as a land of stone, dry pyramids, sandy statues, and golden masks. But the living reality of the people was green, wet, and teeming with creatures that wanted to eat them, help them, or simply coexist with them. The ecosystem of the Nile was not just a backdrop for human history, it was a participant. Every plant and every animal held a dual citizenship. They were physical entities in the mud, and they were divine symbols in the sky. Let us begin with the plants, specifically the one that held the secret of the universe folded within its petals, the blue lotus. This water lily was everywhere. It floated in the still backwaters of the canals and the delta swamps. To a modern botanist, Nymphea caerulea is a plant that opens its petals during the day and closes them at night, sinking slightly underwater. To an ancient Egyptian, this behavior was not botany, it was theology. They watched this flower rise from the dark, chaotic mud, open its brilliant blue petals to greet the sun, and then retreat back into the darkness at night. It was the perfect mirror of the sun god, Ra. It was the daily cycle of birth, death, and rebirth played out in a flower. Because of this, the lotus became the symbol of creation. In their art, they often depicted the infant sun god sitting inside a lotus blossom. It was also a narcotic. The Egyptians would steep the flowers in wine to create a drink that induced a mild, dreamy euphoria. At their banquets, they sniffed the lotus, not just for its scent, but to detach themselves slightly from the harshness of reality. It was the scent of the divine. On the drier ground, standing like guardians against the heat, were the sycamore fig trees. The sycamore was the tree of life. In a land where the sun strikes with the force of a physical blow, shade is a precious commodity. The wide-spreading branches of the sycamore offered shelter. The Egyptians believed that the goddess Hathor lived inside the tree. They often depicted her leaning out of the trunk to offer food and cool water to the thirsty souls of the dead passing by. To cut down a sycamore was not just landscaping, it was an eviction of a goddess. But if the flora was welcoming, the fauna was often terrifying. The river was the domain of the crocodile. We must understand the psychological weight of this animal. Today we might worry about traffic or the stock market. The ancient Egyptian worried about being dragged underwater by a prehistoric killing machine while doing the laundry. The Nile crocodile is an apex predator that can grow to 20 feet in length. It is a master of ambush. It can lie perfectly still, looking exactly like a floating log, until the moment it strikes. For the villagers, the river was their life source. They had to drink from it, bathe in it, and fish in it. But it was also a threat. This tension created a deep respect. As we noted earlier, they worshipped the crocodile as the god Sobek. It was a form of spiritual insurance. I respect you, I feed you in the temple, so please do not eat my children. The crocodile represented the raw, brutal power of the pharaoh. It was violence that enforced order. Even more dangerous than the crocodile, however, was the hippopotamus. The Greeks called it the river horse, but the Egyptians knew better. They knew it was a tank made of meat and rage. The male hippo is aggressively territorial and unpredictable. A bull hippo could snap a papyrus boat in half with a single bite, drowning the fisherman or leaving him to the crocodiles. In Egyptian mythology, the hippo was often associated with Set, the god of chaos and violence. In tomb paintings, we see scenes of hippo hunting, where the pharaoh stands on a skiff harpooning the beast. This wasn't just sport, it was a ritual act of maintaining cosmic order, Ma'at. By killing the beast of chaos, the king ensured that the universe would not fall into disorder. However, the female hippo, specifically a pregnant one, was viewed differently. She was Taweret, the goddess of childbirth. Depicted as a standing hippo with the breasts of a woman and the tail of a crocodile, she was a fierce protector. The logic was sound. There is nothing in nature more dangerous than a mother hippo defending her calf. Egyptian women kept amulets of this terrifying goddess to protect them during labor, hoping she would fight off the spirits of death with the same ferocity she used in the river. If we look up from the water to the sky, we see the birds that defined the Egyptian horizon. The most iconic was the ibis. With its long, curved beak and white feathers, the ibis patrolled the mudflats searching for food. The Egyptians observed the way the bird's beak curved like a crescent moon, and how it seemed to be constantly writing in the mud as it pecked. Consequently, they associated it with Thoth, the god of wisdom, writing, and the moon. It was Thoth who invented hieroglyphs. Millions of these birds were mummified and stacked in underground catacombs as offerings. It is a strange legacy for a bird, to be a scavenger in life and a librarian in death. Soaring high above them was the falcon. The peregrine falcon is the fastest animal on the planet in a dive. The Egyptians watched it hang motionless in the high air, seeing everything before dropping like a stone to kill its prey. It was the perfect symbol for the king. The god Horus was the falcon, the lord of the sky, the protector of the throne. The pharaoh was the living Horus. He was the predator who watched over the flock, the view from above that missed nothing. But perhaps the most significant animal relationship in Egyptian history was with the humble cat. The domestication of the cat in Egypt wasn't about companionship, it was about national security. Egypt was the grain storehouse of the ancient world. They had massive silos filled with wheat and barley. Where there is grain, there are rats, and where there are rats, you risk famine and disease. The wild African wildcat, Felis libica, began to wander into the villages, attracted by the rodents. The Egyptians, pragmatic as always, welcomed them. They realized that this small, sleek killer was the guardian of their food supply. Over centuries, the relationship deepened. The cat moved from the granary to the living room. They became the avatar of the goddess Bastet, representing home, fertility, and protection. To kill a cat, even accidentally, was a capital crime punishable by death. Herodotus tells us that if a house caught fire, the Egyptians would worry more about saving the cats than putting out the fire. Finally, we must look at the smallest and perhaps most profound creature in their ecosystem, the scarab beetle. To us, this is a dung beetle. Its life consists of finding animal waste, rolling it into a perfect ball, and rolling it across the sand to bury it. It is a dirty, lowly existence. But the Egyptians looked at this beetle and saw the cosmos. They watched the beetle rolling a ball of dung and saw a parallel to the sun god Khepri, rolling the ball of the sun across the sky every day. They noticed that baby beetles seemed to emerge spontaneously from the dung ball, not realizing the eggs had been laid inside. To them, this was self-creation. It was life emerging from dead matter. So the humble dung beetle became the symbol of resurrection and eternal life. They carved scarabs out of precious stones, lapis lazuli, turquoise, gold, and placed them over the hearts of mummies. They inscribed prayers on the flat undersides of these stone beetles. The heart scarab was charged with a specific job: to keep the heart silent during the judgment of Osiris, ensuring it didn't confess the sins of the deceased. It is the ultimate Egyptian paradox. The creature that spends its life in excrement became the symbol of the golden sun and the eternal soul. The ecosystem of the Nile was a constant reminder of the dual nature of existence. The beautiful lotus grew from the mud. The life-giving river hid the deadly crocodile. The chaotic hippo protected the pregnant mother. The scavenger beetle pushed the sun. The Egyptians did not live apart from nature. They lived woven into it. They didn't see animals and plants. They saw neighbors, gods, monsters, and messages. Every time a farmer walked through the tall papyrus reeds and heard the splash of a heavy body in the water, he felt the thrill of fear and the comfort of belief. He knew he was walking through a divine garden, where every leaf and every claw had a purpose in the great machinery of Ma'at. Death, for most cultures in the ancient world, was a terrifying finality. It was a dark door that slammed shut, leaving nothing behind but silence and dust. In Mesopotamia, the afterlife was a gloomy, grey underworld where souls ate dust and lived in darkness. In Greece, Hades was a place of shadows and forgetfulness. But in Egypt, death was viewed entirely differently. It wasn't a wall, it was a horizon. And the reason for this unique optimism was, once again, the river. To understand the Egyptian obsession with rebirth, you simply have to look at the calendar of the soil. Every year the land died. During the dry season of Shemu, the earth cracked, the plants withered, and the world turned brown and sterile. It looked dead. It was dead. But then the water returned. The flood covered the corpse of the land, and miraculously, life emerged again, greener, stronger, and vibrant. The Egyptian farmer didn't need faith to believe in resurrection. He saw it happen in his backyard every single September. If the land could die and return to life, why couldn't a human being? This logic created a geography of life and death that split the country in half. The Nile flows from south to north, but the sun moves from east to west. This intersection created a sacred grid. The east bank of the Nile, where the sun rose, was the land of the living. This was where the cities were built, where the markets bustled, and where people lived their daily lives. The West Bank, where the sun set or died every evening, was the land of the dead. If you look at a map of ancient Egypt, you will see a stark pattern. The temples for the living gods are mostly on the east. The pyramids, the tombs, the Valley of the Kings, and the vast necropolises are almost exclusively on the west. Crossing the river from east to west was not just a commute. It was a ritual journey from the temporal world to the eternal one. The Egyptians didn't say someone died. They said they went to the west. This belief system was anchored in the myth of Osiris, which we touched upon earlier, but we must now examine it as a mechanism of hope. Osiris was not just a king who died. He was the botanical definition of the crop cycle. In their rituals, the priests would create corn mummies or Osiris beds. These were wooden frames in the shape of the god, filled with Nile mud and planted with seeds. They were placed in the dark tombs of the deceased. In the darkness of the tomb, the seeds would germinate and sprout green shoots from the body of the god. It was a powerful piece of sympathetic magic. It proved that life was dormant inside the darkness. When the family sealed the tomb, they weren't locking their loved one away in a prison. They were planting them like a seed in the black mud, waiting for the spiritual flood to wake them up. This connection between the river and the body led to the complex process of mummification. We often think of mummies as scary movie monsters or morbid curiosities, but the intent behind mummification was deeply loving and scientifically pragmatic. The Egyptians believed that the soul, the ka and the ba, needed a physical anchor to return to. If the body rotted away, the soul would be lost, wandering eternally like a ghost. To prevent this, they looked to nature. They had noticed that bodies buried naturally in the hot, dry sand of the desert were preserved by dehydration. They tried to replicate this process artificially using natron, a natural salt mixture found in dry riverbeds. The process was brutal but effective. They removed the wet internal organs, which would cause rot, and stored them in canopic jars. Then they covered the body in natron for 40 days to dry it out completely. Finally, they wrapped it in hundreds of yards of linen. Why linen? Because linen comes from flax, a plant of the river. By wrapping the body in the product of the Nile, they were symbolically wrapping the deceased in a cocoon of potential life. The mummy was not a corpse. It was a chrysalis waiting for the butterfly to emerge. But where would this butterfly go? This is where the Nile's influence becomes most obvious. Most religions imagine heaven as something completely different from earth. A city of clouds, a nirvana of nothingness, or a hall of heroes. The Egyptians had no interest in a strange new world. They loved their own world too much. They wanted the afterlife to be exactly like Egypt, just without the problems. They called their paradise Aru, or the Field of Reeds. Descriptions of Aru are fascinatingly specific. It was an island located in the east, where the sun rose. It was a lush green landscape, filled with an endless network of canals and riverbanks. In this paradise, the crops grew taller than a man. The Nile was always at the perfect level for irrigation. There were no droughts, no locusts, and crucially, no tax collectors. However, there was a catch. It was still an agricultural society. Even in heaven, you had to work. The fields of eternity still needed to be plowed, sown, and harvested. This prospect of eternal manual labor was a bit worrying, especially for the rich nobles who hadn't done a day of physical work in their lives. They didn't want to spend eternity knee-deep in celestial mud. So they invented a solution, the Ushabti. Ushabtis were small figurines, usually made of blue faience or wood, that were buried with the deceased. They were often shaped like mummies and held tiny farming tools, a hoe and a basket, in their hands. Their name translates roughly to the answerers. The idea was brilliant. When the god Osiris called out the roll in the afterlife and said, "Work detail, time to plow the fields of Aru," the magic spell written on the Ushabti would activate. The little figurine would step forward and say, "Here I am, I will do it," taking the place of the deceased. Some pharaohs were buried with hundreds of these servants, one for every day of the year, plus overseers to manage them. It was a perfect example of the Egyptian mindset. They wanted the spiritual rebirth of the Nile, but they wanted the social hierarchy of the state to remain intact. This cycle of rebirth also influenced their concept of time. We see time as linear, a straight line moving from the past into the future. The Egyptians saw time as a spiral or a wave. They had two words for time, Nehe and Jet. Nehe was cyclical time, the time of the sun rising and setting, the river flooding and receding, the seasons changing. It was dynamic and recurring. Jet was static eternity, the timelessness of the stone, the desert, and the dead. It was the finished state. Life was the interplay between these two. The pharaoh's job was to maintain Ma'at, order, so that the cycle of Nehi could continue safely within the stability of Jet. When a king died, it was a terrifying moment because the cycle was broken. The sun had fallen from the sky. Chaos threatened to enter. That is why the coronation of the new king was so vital. It was the sunrise that restarted the engine of the universe. The river taught them that interruptions were temporary. The water might drop, the fields might dry up, but the water always came back. This gave the Egyptians a profound sense of resilience. They were not a people given to apocalyptic panic. When the Romans and later the Greeks visited Egypt, they were struck by how calm and traditional the people were. They seemed to possess a quiet confidence that they would outlast everyone. And in a way, they were right. The individual might die, but the community, the herd of God, would continue. The tomb paintings reflect this joy of life. In many cultures, funerary art is somber and depressing. In Egypt, the tombs are explosions of color and activity. They show scenes of parties, hunting in the marshes, grape harvesting, beer brewing, and families holding hands. Why paint a party in a tomb? Because the image makes it real. By painting the abundance of the Nile on the walls, they ensured that the deceased would have that abundance forever. The art was a magical generator. If you painted a table piled high with bread, onions, and roast duck, the deceased would never go hungry in the West. The river had taught them that matter is never destroyed. It just changes form. The water becomes the cloud becomes the rain becomes the river becomes the wheat becomes the bread becomes the man, and the man eventually becomes the soil that feeds the wheat. It was a closed loop of energy. So, when an ancient Egyptian looked at the Nile, he didn't just see a resource for agriculture, he saw the bloodstream of the divine. He saw the proof that the end is not the end. He knew that just as the sun dips below the western horizon, only to be reborn in the east, he too would travel through the darkness of the Duat and emerge into the light of the field of reeds. And there, in that perfect sun-drenched mirror of his homeland, he would find his house, his family, and his river, flowing cool and eternal, washing away the dust of death. If you look at a map of the ancient world, most civilizations look like blobs. Mesopotamia is a sprawling, undefined patch between two rivers. Greece is a fractured collection of islands and valleys. Rome eventually became a massive, amorphous circle around the Mediterranean. But Egypt was different. Egypt was a line. It was a single vertical stroke of green cutting through a vast expanse of yellow. This unique geometry, a country that was essentially a 4,000-mile-long tube with a fan at the top, did something that no other geography in history has ever done. It forced a diverse group of tribes to become a single, unified organism. Before there was an Egypt, there were the two lands. This dualism is fundamental to understanding the Egyptian soul. They didn't see their country as a monolithic whole. They saw it as two distinct opposing forces held together by the sheer will of the river and the king. To the south lay Upper Egypt, Ta Shemau. This was the valley, a narrow, rugged strip of land hemmed in by limestone cliffs. It was a place of intensity, closer to the African source. The culture here was hardy, focused on hunting and herding as much as farming. Its symbol was the lotus flower, and its ruler wore the white crown, Hedjet, a tall, conical helmet that looked like a bowling pin. To the north lay Lower Egypt, Tamehu. This was the delta, a wide, marshy, flat triangle where the river spread out into the sea. It was a land of abundance, trade, and openness to the Mediterranean world. It was lush and humid. Its symbol was the papyrus plant, and its ruler wore the red crown, Deshret, a flat, chair-shaped headpiece with a strange curlicue wire protruding from the front. For centuries, these two worlds existed separately. They had different dialects, different customs, and different gods. In any other part of the world, they would have remained separate countries, likely fighting endless border wars, just as France and Germany did for centuries. But the Nile wouldn't allow it. The river flows north, but the wind blows south. As we discussed, this created a natural circulatory system. It was impossible to remain isolated when your neighbor upstream could float an army down to your doorstep in a week, and you could sail your own fleet up to his in 10 days. The geography demanded unity. The moment of unification around 3100 BC is the Big Bang of Egyptian history. History tells us it was the work of a king named Narmer, or sometimes referred to as Manes. The famous Narmer palette, a slab of slate used for grinding cosmetics, tells the story in brutal, graphic detail. On one side, we see the king wearing the white crown of the south, raising a mace to smash the head of a northern enemy. On the other side, we see him wearing the red crown of the north, inspecting the decapitated bodies of his foes. But look closely at what happens next in the iconography. Narmer didn't just conquer the north and impose southern culture upon it. He didn't burn the red crown. Instead, he did something brilliant. He put one crown inside the other. He created the shent, the double crown. The white cone was fitted inside the red chair. It was a perfect visual synthesis. From that moment on, every pharaoh was known as the Lord of the Two Lands. This wasn't just a fancy title. It was a political statement. It acknowledged that Egypt was a duality, and the king was the bridge, the buckle that held the two opposing forces together. This concept of unification became the obsession of the state. The Egyptians developed a symbol called the Sema Tawi. You see it on the side of almost every statue of a sitting pharaoh. It depicts the windpipe of the lungs, symbolizing the vital breath, with two plants being tied together around it, the lotus of the south and the papyrus of the north. It is a knot. The king's primary job was not just to rule, it was to keep the knot from slipping. They lived in constant fear that if the central authority weakened, the knot would untie, and the country would snap back into two hostile halves. And indeed, every time the central government collapsed during the intermediate periods, that is exactly what happened. The valley and the delta would drift apart until a new strongman came along to retie the knot. Once the political unification was achieved, the river began the slow, steady work of cultural unification. Because communication was so frictionless along the waterway, ideas traveled just as fast as goods. In a mountainous country like Greece, a village in one valley might speak a completely different dialect from a village 20 miles away on the other side of a ridge. Isolation breeds diversity, but on the Nile, everyone was neighbors. A new style of pottery invented in Memphis in the north could be loaded onto a barge and sold in the markets of Elephantine in the deep south within 2 weeks. A song composed in Thebes would be hummed by boatmen in the delta a month later. This created a remarkable standardization. If you look at Egyptian art, you will notice something strange. It hardly changes for 3,000 years. Her statue from the Old Kingdom looks remarkably similar to a statue from the late period, separated by 2 millennia. This consistency wasn't due to a lack of creativity. It was intentional. It was a byproduct of the river's connectivity. The artistic canons, the grid system used to draw figures, the specific way of carving hieroglyphs, were developed in the royal workshops and then exported up and down the river. Because everyone was connected to the same main artery, the official culture flushed through the entire system constantly. The river also unified the language. While there were certainly regional accents, a northerner might sound different from a southerner, they all spoke the same Egyptian language. They all used the same administrative terms. This allowed for a bureaucracy that was terrifyingly efficient. A scribe in a southern outpost could write an order for grain using the exact same terminology and script as a scribe in the northern capital. The Nile acted like a giant fiber optic cable, ensuring that the signal from the brain, the pharaoh, reached the toes, the border forts, without distortion. Religion, too, was unified by the water. Local gods never truly disappeared. The Egyptians were hoarders of deities and never threw anything away. But they were absorbed into a national system. The local sun god of Heliopolis, Ra, became the supreme god of the state. Later, the local ram god of Thebes, Amun, merged with him to become Amun-Ra. These syncretisms, combinations of gods, were theological treaties. They were ways of saying, your God and my God are actually the same person. It was a brilliant way to stop religious wars before they started, and it was made possible because the river allowed the priests to travel, debate, and align their mythologies. Even the architecture was standardized by the river. The columns in the great temples were carved to look like bundles of papyrus or lotus stems. When a peasant from the far south entered a temple in the north, he saw familiar shapes. He saw the plants of the river carved in stone. He felt at home because the visual language of the architecture was drawn from the same ecosystem he saw every day. However, this unification had a psychological side effect. It made the Egyptians incredibly insular. They believed that their land was the only true land. They called Egypt Kemet, the Black Land, or simply the land. Foreign countries were the Nine Bows, enemies of order. Because their world was so unified, so complete and so perfect, they had very little interest in what happened outside of it. Why would you leave? Outside the Nile Valley, there was only chaotic desert, strange people who didn't speak the language, and rivers that flowed wrong, like the Euphrates in Mesopotamia, which flowed south, confusing the Egyptians greatly. This sense of Egypt versus the world strengthened their internal bond. They were the people of the river. Everyone else was just unfortunate enough to be born somewhere else. There is a poignant story from the tale of Sinuhe, a piece of literature from the Middle Kingdom. Sinuhe is an Egyptian official who flees Egypt and lives in exile in Canaan, modern-day Israel, Palestine. He becomes rich and successful there, but as he grows old, he falls into a deep depression. He doesn't care about his wealth. He is terrified of dying in a foreign land. His fear is specific. He doesn't want to be buried in the sand by Asiatics wrapped in a sheepskin. He wants to be mummified. He wants the oil of the Nile. He wants a stone tomb in the west. When the pharaoh finally invites him back, Sinuhe describes the relief of returning to Egypt as if he were being reborn. The unification of the culture was so strong that an Egyptian soul literally could not find peace anywhere else on earth. The Nile, therefore, did not just act as a trade route or an irrigation ditch. It was the mold that pressed the clay of the people into a single recognizable shape. It took a collection of scattered African tribes and Mediterranean settlers and fused them into the first nation-state in history. It created a mental map where North and South were not enemies, but partners in a divine balance. The red crown and the white crown, the papyrus and the lotus, the bee and the sedge, these dualities were woven together so tightly by the river that even 3,000 years of history couldn't pull them apart. If you assume that the ancient Egyptians were a solemn, gloomy people because they spent so much time building tombs, you would be entirely wrong. In reality, they were arguably the biggest party animals of the ancient world. Herodotus, the Greek historian who visited Egypt in the 5th century BC, remarked that the Egyptians held more religious festivals than any other people he had ever met, and these festivals were not quiet, pious prayer circles. They were loud, colorful, and intoxicated celebrations that stopped the entire country in its tracks. And naturally, the schedule for this national calendar of partying was dictated by the river. The most spectacular of these events was the Opet festival in Thebes. This was held during the second month of the flood season, Akhet. The logic was practical. The fields were underwater. The farmers couldn't farm, so the entire population was available to line the streets and cheer. The festival was essentially a honeymoon for the gods. The statue of the supreme god, Amun, was taken out of his sanctuary in the massive Karnak temple. He was placed inside a sacred bark, a portable boat covered in gold leaf. This wasn't a seaworthy vessel. It was a palanquin carried on the shoulders of priests. Imagine the scene. The air is thick with the smoke of burning frankincense, so much smoke that the texts say it masked the sun. 30 or 40 priests, their heads shaved and their linen robes spotless, groan under the weight of the golden boat. They carry Amun from Karnak to the Luxor temple, about 2 miles south, but they didn't just walk. For part of the journey, the god traveled on the river itself. The golden bark was loaded onto a massive reel barge called the Uzerhet. This ship was towed upstream against the current by smaller boats, and by crowds of people pulling ropes from the riverbanks. To be one of the people pulling the god's boat was considered a supreme honor. It was also a supreme workout, but the state made sure the volunteers were motivated. The temple records show that thousands of loaves of bread, hundreds of jars of beer, and oxen were slaughtered for the occasion. It was a state-sponsored barbecue on a massive scale. During this procession, something rare happened. Usually, the god was hidden inside the dark sanctuary of the temple, accessible only to the high priest and the pharaoh. But during the Opet festival, the god was out in the world. The common people could approach the bark. They would ask questions. Will my child survive? Is my husband stealing from me? And the priests carrying the boat would interpret the movements of the heavy vessel. A stumble forward meant yes, a recoil backward meant no, as the voice of the god. It was the one time a year the universe answered back. Another major event was the Feast of the Valley, Heb Nefer Eninet. This festival took place during the harvest season, Shemu. While Opet was about the gods, the Feast of the Valley was about the ancestors. The statue of Amun would cross the Nile, traveling from the east bank, the land of the living, to the west bank, the land of the dead. The entire population of the city would follow him. They would cross the river in a chaotic flotilla of small boats, ferries, and skiffs. They weren't going to mourn. They were going to have a picnic. Families would visit the tombs of their ancestors. They would bring huge baskets of food and, crucially, vast quantities of wine and beer. They would enter the tomb chapels, lay out the meal, and eat with the dead. They believed that the Ka, spirit of the deceased, came out to absorb the essence of the food, while the living ate the physical substance. It was a joyous reunion. You told your grandfather's ghost the gossip of the village. You introduced him to the new baby. You complained about the taxes, and then you got drunk. We have to address the drinking. In many modern religions, intoxication is seen as a sin or a vice. In ancient Egypt, it was a theological necessity. There was a specific festival called the Festival of Drunkenness. It was dedicated to the goddess Hathor, or Sekhmet. The myth behind it is fascinatingly grim. The story goes that the sun god Ra, angry at humanity's rebellion, sent his daughter, the lioness Sekhmet, to destroy mankind. She began slaughtering people, drinking their blood, and enjoying it a little too much. Ra realized that if he didn't stop her, there would be no humans left. So he ordered his priests to brew 7,000 jars of beer and dye it red with pomegranate juice. They poured this red beer over the fields. Sekhmet, thinking it was human blood, drank it all. She became so incredibly drunk that she passed out and forgot to kill everyone. Humanity was saved by a hangover. Therefore, getting drunk during her festival wasn't just partying, it was a ritual reenactment of the salvation of the world. To be sober was almost disrespectful. The texts describe participants drinking until they experienced a traveling through the marshes, a euphemism for passing out. But not all festivals were loud. Some were tense. Consider the wager of the Nile. Before the flood arrived, there was always a fear. What if Hapi doesn't come this year? To ensure the arrival of the waters, the people would perform offering rituals at the riverbank. There is a persistent modern myth that the ancient Egyptians sacrificed a beautiful virgin girl, the bride of the Nile, by throwing her into the river to appease the god. This is almost certainly false. It is a later invention, likely a dramatic Roman or Arab exaggeration of Egyptian customs. The Egyptians valued human life and order, ma'at, too much for chaotic human sacrifice. However, they did throw brides into the river. They were dolls. They crafted beautiful figures made of wood or clay, dressed them in the finest linen and jewelry, and tossed them into the swirling waters. It was a symbolic marriage. The river needed a partner to be fertile. By giving Hapi a wife, they ensured the fertilization of the land. This tradition was so strong that it survived the fall of the pharaohs, the arrival of Christianity, and the coming of Islam. Even today, in a modified form, the celebration of Wafa el-Nil, the fidelity of the Nile, continues, though now it is purely cultural rather than religious. We also see the origins of a festival that is still celebrated in Egypt today, Sham el-Nessim. Translating to smelling the breeze, this festival dates back to at least the Old Kingdom, 2700 BC. It marked the beginning of spring. The ancients would go out to the riverbanks, smell the fresh air and eat a very specific meal, salted, fermented fish called fezik, green onions and lettuce. It is remarkable to think that if you walk through Cairo or Luxor today during Sham el-Nessim, you will see families doing exactly the same thing. They sit by the Nile, they eat the same salted fish, which smells incredibly pungent, and they celebrate the continuity of life. 5,000 years of empires, invasions, and religious changes couldn't kill the simple joy of eating a salty fish by the river in the spring. These festivals served a critical social function. Egyptian society was rigid. The peasant was at the bottom. The pharaoh was at the top. But during the great river festivals, the barriers became porous. For a few days, the peasant could eat meat that was usually reserved for the rich. He could get drunk alongside the scribe. He could see the gold of the gods with his own eyes. The river, which physically connected the geography of the country, also socially connected its people through these moments of collective ecstasy. The festivals were the pressure release valve of the state. You can work a man to death building a pyramid, provided you give him a really good party twice a year. Moreover, these traditions reinforced the cyclical nature of time. A festival wasn't just a date on a calendar, it was a reset button. When the king performed the Hebsed festival, the Jubilee, after 30 years of rule, he would run a ritual race to prove he was still fit to command the flood and the field. It was a performance of vitality. So life on the Nile was a rhythm of labor and leisure. The silence of the growing season was broken by the thunder of drums. The smell of sweat was replaced by the smell of roasted duck. And always in the background, the river flowed, the guest of honor at every party, the silent god who paid for the beer. In the crowded pantheon of Egyptian deities, there were gods for everything. There were gods for the sun, the moon, writing, magic, war, and even for scorpions. Most of these gods lived in the sky or in the abstract realm of the afterlife. They were distant, golden, and perfect. But Hapi was different. Hapi was wet, messy, and undeniably real. Hapi was not just the god of the Nile, he was the Nile. Specifically, he was the personification of the inundation, the annual flood that kept the civilization alive. While the priests might offer incense to Amun-Ra for the spiritual health of the king, every single person in Egypt, from the pharaoh to the lowest slave, prayed to Hapi for their physical survival. If Ra decided to take a day off, it would be dark, but people could survive. If Hapi took a year off, everyone died. It was that simple. Because of this crushing dependency, the image of Hapi is unique in Egyptian art. He is not depicted as a warrior with a sword or a majestic falcon. He is shown as a figure that defies gender norms. He is ostensibly male, wearing a loincloth and a false beard, but he has the prominent breasts of a nursing mother and a large, sagging potbelly. To a modern eye, he might look out of shape. To an ancient Egyptian, he looked perfect. His heaviness represented abundance. The skinny god would imply famine. A god with a flat stomach meant the granaries were empty. Hapi's breasts symbolized that he nursed the land, providing the milk of the harvest. He was often depicted with skin painted blue or green, representing the water and the vegetation. He was the father of the gods and the mother of the food. It is a profound irony that this god, who was arguably the most important deity for the economy, had almost no temples. You can visit Egypt today and see the massive complexes dedicated to Horus, Isis, and Karnak, but you will not find a great temple of Hapi. The reason is theological pragmatism. You build a temple to provide a house for a god who lives in the sky, but Hapi lived in the river. The Nile was his temple. Why build a stone box for a god who occupies a 4,000-mile-long channel? Instead of going to a church, the people went to the riverbank. The cult of Hapi was an open-air religion. The rituals were timed specifically to the water levels. As the summer heat intensified and the low Nile threatened to dry out the land, the anxiety would build. The priests would travel to specific sacred locations, most notably at Gebel el Silsila, a place where the river narrows between sandstone cliffs. Here the current is strong and turbulent. They believed this was one of the places where the flood burst forth from the underworld. At these sites they cast offerings directly into the swirling water. They threw in gold jewelry, grain, and sacred amulets. It was a direct transaction. Here is our wealth. Please send us yours. We possess a surviving text known as the Hymn to Hapi. It is one of the most beautiful and desperate pieces of literature from the ancient world. It captures the absolute terror of a low flood. One verse reads, "If he is sluggish, the noses maintain their blockage, and everyone is poor. If he rises, the land is in jubilation, and every stomach is full." The phrase "noses maintain their blockage" is a vivid Egyptian idiom. To have an open nose meant to breathe, to live, to be happy. A blocked nose meant suffocation and misery. Hapi was the breath of the country. However, the relationship between the pharaoh and Hapi was complicated. The pharaoh claimed to be a god on earth. Part of his job description was maintaining Ma'at, cosmic order. This implied that the pharaoh could control nature, but everyone knew deep down that the pharaoh couldn't actually tell the river what to do. This created a political nightmare whenever the flood failed. There is a famous historical record carved onto a granite rock on Sahel Island, known as the Famine Stela. It tells a story set in the time of King Djoser, the builder of the first step pyramid. The text describes a crisis. For 7 years, the Nile had not risen. The king speaks in the text, sounding genuinely panicked. "I was in mourning on my throne and my heart was extremely sad. The Nile has not come in time for a period of 7 years. Grain is scarce, kernels are dried up, everything that one eats is short." The king didn't call his generals. He called his architect and sage, Imhotep. He asked, "Where does the Nile come from? Who is the god there? I need to know." Imhotep searched the ancient archives and discovered that the waters were controlled by the ram-headed god Khnum, who was closely linked with Hapi at the source. The king realized he had neglected this god. He immediately endowed a new temple, offered massive gifts, and promised land to the priesthood. Miraculously, the text says, the Nile rose. This story serves as a perfect example of spiritual bureaucratic troubleshooting. When the engine of the universe broke down, the Egyptians didn't assume physics was broken. They assumed they had forgotten to pay the operator. Hapi also played a crucial role in the symbolism of unification. We previously discussed the Sematawi symbol, the tying of the knot between Upper and Lower Egypt. In most depictions of this symbol, it is not the pharaoh tying the knot, it is two Hapis. One Hapi wears the papyrus plant on his head, representing the north, and the other wears the lotus, representing the south. They stand facing each other, pulling the ropes tight to bind the windpipe of the country. This is a deep political insight. The Egyptians recognized that no army and no politician could truly hold the country together. Only the river could do that. The economy of the water was the binding force. It was the shared dependence on the flood that made a southerner and a northerner brothers. The two Hapis are identical, mirror images, suggesting that ultimately, despite the cultural differences, the river makes everyone the same. The cult also had its darker, more respectful side. The Egyptians knew that Hapi was not good in the moral sense. He was chaotic. A flood that was too high was just as deadly as a flood that was too low. A high Nile would smash the dikes, wash away entire villages, drown the livestock, and rot the seed in the ground. It was a force of destruction. Therefore, Hapi was often equated with Nun, the primordial chaos. When the flood arrived, chaos was temporarily allowed to enter the ordered world of Egypt. The land became a formless ocean again. This was a dangerous time. The priests had to perform rituals to ensure that the chaos was contained, that the water would remain just long enough to fertilize, but not long enough to destroy. They were trying to domesticate a monster. Interestingly, the color associated with Hapi, blue, became a color of protection. We see this in the famous Egyptian blue pigment used on amulets and beads. Faience, a ceramic material made of crushed quartz that turns a brilliant turquoise blue when fired, was considered to be a solid form of Nile luminosity. When an Egyptian wore a blue faience necklace, they were wearing a piece of the river. They were wearing a solidified prayer to Hapi. As the centuries passed and Egypt fell under the rule of the Greeks and then the Romans, many of the old gods faded. The intricate theology of Amun-Ra became less relevant to the foreign rulers. But the cult of Hapi persisted. Why? Because the Romans needed the grain. Rome called Egypt its breadbasket. The emperor in Rome knew that if the Nile failed, the mob in Rome would starve and riot. So even the Roman emperors, who cared little for animal-headed gods, treated the Nile with superstitious dread. They continued the festivals. They continued the measurements at the Nilometer. They understood that Hapi was the one god you couldn't afford to ignore. Even today, the echo of Hapi remains. In the Coptic Christian Church of Egypt, there are liturgies that pray for the rising of the waters. The name has changed, the theology has shifted, but the fundamental request is exactly the same as the one carved on the famine stela 4,000 years ago. Please let the water come. Hapi was a god without a home, a man who was also a woman, a force that was both life and death. He was the mud on the sandals of the farmer and the gold in the vault of the king. And while the temples of the other gods have turned to ruins and silence, Hapi's temple, the river itself, is still flowing, still rising, and still deciding the fate of the land. To understand the map of ancient Egypt, you must forget the modern concept of urban planning. Today we build cities where the highways intersect. In ancient Egypt, they built cities where the water allowed them to stand without drowning. The settlement pattern of the Nile Valley was dictated entirely by the physics of the flood. You couldn't just build a house anywhere you pleased. If you built too close to the river, your living room would be underwater in August. If you built too far back, you were in the burning desert. So the Egyptians aimed for the turtlebacks. These were natural mounds of gravel and sand, called gezeras, that rose slightly above the floodplain. They were islands of safety. Over thousands of years, a fascinating geological phenomenon occurred. People lived on these mounds, built mud brick houses, let them crumble, and built new houses on top of the debris. Century after century, the mounds grew taller, rising on layers of their own history. These artificial hills, known as tells, became the anchors of civilization. They were the safe harbors in a sea of seasonal mud. The most important of these anchors was Memphis. Located exactly at the apex of the delta, the precise spot where the narrow valley opens up into the wide fan of the north. Memphis was the balance of the two lands. It was founded around 3100 BC, supposedly by King Menes the Unifier. For centuries, Memphis was the New York, the London, and the Tokyo of the ancient world combined. It was the administrative brain of the empire. The Egyptians called it Inib Hedge, meaning the white walls, referring to the massive limestone fortress that originally surrounded it. Life in Memphis was a chaotic, cosmopolitan assault on the senses. It was a city of bureaucrats, craftsmen, and merchants. Because it was the gateway to the Delta, it was full of foreigners, Syrians, Nubians, Libyans, all shouting in different dialects, trading oil, cedar, and wine. The streets were narrow, winding, and unpaved. They smelled of baking bread, roasting meat, and inevitably open sewage. But if you go to Memphis today, you will find almost nothing. A few statues lying in a garden, a sphinx, some palm trees. This brings us to the great architectural irony of Egypt. Memphis was the capital for 1,000 years. It housed the royal palaces. But because these palaces were built for the living, they were built of mud brick. They were grand, painted with vibrant murals and draped in linen. But they were made of earth. When the capital moved and the roofs were neglected, the rain and the wind dissolved the city back into the mud from which it came. The greatest city on earth simply melted. In contrast, travel 400 miles south to Thebes, modern Luxor, and the story is different. Thebes was the religious capital, the southern city. While Memphis was the brain, Thebes was the heart. This was the home of Amun-Ra, the king of gods, and because it was a city dedicated to the eternal, it was built of stone. The centerpiece of Thebes was the Karnak temple complex. Karnak is not just a temple, it is a Vatican city of stone. It is the largest religious structure ever built by human hands. Every pharaoh for 1,500 years felt the need to add something to it. A pylon, a court, an obelisk, a shrine. It was a construction site that never closed. Walking into Karnak in ancient times was designed to be a crushing experience of intimidation. You would pass through massive gates, past statues of the king that were 50 feet high. You would enter the hypostyle hall, a forest of 134 giant columns, each so wide that 10 men holding hands could not encircle it. The light was controlled perfectly. The outer courts were bright with sun. As you moved deeper into the temple, the floor level rose, the ceiling dropped, and the light grew dimmer. By the time you reached the Holy of Holies, where the god lived, it was pitch black, lit only by the flicker of oil lamps. This was architecture as psychological warfare. It told the small mortal human, you are nothing. The god is everything. But Thebes was a split city. The East Bank was for the living temples, Karnak and Luxor. The West Bank was the city of the dead. The West Bank of Thebes was an industry unto itself. It wasn't just a cemetery, it was a massive economic engine. There were villages of professional tomb builders like Deir el-Medina living there. There were mortuary temples where priests performed daily rituals for dead kings who had been gone for centuries. The vibe on the West Bank was quieter, solemn, and dusty. It was a place of memory. The mortuary temples, like the Ramesseum or the Temple of Hatshepsut, were built at the edge of the cultivation, right where the green mud met the yellow cliff. They stood as border guards between the world of time and the world of eternity. Further south, near the first cataract, stood Elephantine. This was a frontier town. Located on an island in the middle of the river, it was the fortress that guarded the southern border against Nubia. The name comes from the smooth black rocks in the river that looked like swimming elephants, or perhaps because it was the center of the ivory trade. Elephantine had a rough military energy. It was a garrison town. The god worshipped here was Khnum, the ram-headed potter who controlled the source of the Nile. The temple of Khnum contained one of the most important devices in the empire, the primary Nilometer. The priests of Elephantine were powerful because they were the first to know. They saw the flood level before anyone else in Egypt. They could send a message boat racing north to Memphis, warning the pharaoh, it's a high flood this year, raise the taxes, or it's a low flood, prepare the granaries. They were the meteorologists of the state. But there is one city that stands out as a bizarre exception to the rule, Akhetaten, modern Amarna. In the long history of Egypt, cities usually grew organically over centuries, but around 1350 BC, the heretic pharaoh Akhenaten decided to build a brand new capital from scratch in the middle of nowhere. He chose a site in Middle Egypt where the cliffs broke open to form a vast desert bay. No one had ever lived there. It belonged to no god. He vowed to build a city dedicated solely to his new god, the Aten, the sun disk. Akhetaten was a flash city. It went up in a matter of years, built with small standardized stone blocks called talatat that could be carried by a single man. It was a city of speed. It had broad avenues for the king's chariot processions, open-air temples with no roofs to let the sun in, and sprawling palaces. For about 15 years it was the center of the world. The gold flowed here. The ambassadors came here. And then Akhenaten died. The city was abandoned almost immediately. The court moved back to Memphis. The priests moved back to Thebes. The wind took over Akhetaten. Because it was never built over by later generations, it is the one place where archaeologists can see exactly what an ancient Egyptian city looked like, a ghost town preserved in the sand. It stands as a monument to hubris. Akhenaten thought he could redraw the map of Egypt by royal decree, but the Nile creates the map, not the king. The people return to the old places, the old mounds, and the old gods. We must also mention the port cities of the Delta, like Tanis and later Alexandria. These were the lungs of Egypt, breathing in the air of the Mediterranean. They were marshy, wet, and distinct from the valley. The land here was flat and intersected by dozens of river branches. These cities were built on islands of mud, connected by bridges and canals. They were the interface with the outside world, the places where the rigid traditions of the valley met the fluid ideas of the sea. So the banks of the Nile were a string of pearls. There were the market towns smelling of fish and noise, where farmers bartered grain for linen. There were the temple cities, smelling of incense and stone, where priests performed the rituals that kept the universe spinning. There were the garrison towns, smelling of sweat and bronze, watching the southern horizon. And there were the necropolises, the silent cities of the dead, watching the sunset. They were all different, yet they were all identical in one respect. They all faced the water. The main street of every town was the river. The front door of every temple opened to the river. The logic of the settlement was the logic of the current. Today, the mud brick houses are gone. The bustling markets are just layers of dust under modern fields. But the stone temples remain, standing like skeletons of giant beasts. They remind us of a civilization that knew exactly how to balance the temporary needs of the living with the eternal demands of the gods. We have reached the end of our journey along the riverbanks. We have watched the water rise and fall for 3,000 years. We have seen it build pyramids, crown kings, feed millions, and bury the dead. But before we step off the boat, we must look at the legacy of this incredible force of nature. The story of Egypt is ultimately a story about the triumph of geography over history. Dynasties are fragile things. They are made of men, and men are flawed. The Old Kingdom collapsed because the government grew too arrogant and the local governors too greedy. The Middle Kingdom fell to foreign invaders with horse-drawn chariots. The New Kingdom slowly rotted from within due to corruption and a priesthood that became richer than the pharaoh. But through every collapse, every civil war, and every invasion, the river remained. When the Persians marched in with their iron weapons, they conquered the army, but they couldn't conquer the flood. When Alexander the Great arrived, he didn't try to change Egypt. Egypt changed him. He had to travel to the oracle of Amun in the deep desert to be declared a true son of the god. He understood that to rule this land, you had to bow to its logic. The Nile did not care who wore the crown. It only cared about the season. Even the Romans, the great engineers of the ancient world, looked at the Nile with a mixture of greed and fear. They didn't try to Romanize the Egyptian farmer. They didn't force him to wear a toga or speak Latin. They just wanted the wheat. They understood that the chaotic, muddy magic of the inundation was the engine that fed the citizens of Rome. The emperor might have been the master of the world, but he knew his throne rested on the silt of a river he couldn't control. This resilience is the true miracle of the Egyptian civilization. It was a culture built on a foundation that reset itself every single year. However, the most profound change in the life of the river did not come from an ancient conqueror. It didn't happen in the Bronze Age. It happened in the 20th century. For 5,000 years, the rhythm was the same. Flood, plant, harvest, drought. It was the heartbeat of the continent. The silt arrived, the land was renewed, and the cycle continued. Then, in the 1960s, humanity finally decided to kill Happy. The construction of the Aswan High Dam was a feat of modern engineering that rivaled the pyramids. It was built to tame the beast. The engineers wanted to stop the dangerous floods and the terrifying droughts. They wanted electricity. They wanted predictability. When the massive gates of the high dam closed, the ancient pulse stopped. For the first time in history, the flood did not arrive in Egypt. The water was trapped behind the concrete wall, forming the massive Lake Nasser. The silt, the sacred black mud that had built the civilization, sank to the bottom of the lake, never to reach the fields of the north. The consequences were immediate and profound. The farmers no longer waited for the water. They turned a tap. They could now harvest 2 or 3 crops a year instead of 1. The population exploded because the food supply was constant. Electricity lit up the villages that had been dark since the time of the pharaohs, but something was lost. The black land began to turn grey. Without the fresh layer of natural fertilizer every year, the farmers had to start using chemical fertilizers. The soil, deprived of its annual flushing, began to get salty. The coastline of the delta, no longer built up by new sediment, began to erode into the sea. The pact between the god and the people was broken. The river became a machine, a pipeline for water and power, rather than a living deity. Yet, if you stand on the banks of the Nile today, in the chaotic, vibrant city of Cairo or the quiet villages of Upper Egypt, you can still feel the old power. The modern Egyptians are different from the ancients. They pray to Allah or Christ, not to Amun or Osiris. They speak Arabic, not Coptic or ancient Egyptian. They drive cars and use smartphones. But look closer. Go to the countryside, and you will see a farmer using a shaduf, a simple lever with a bucket on one end and a weight on the other to lift water from a canal. It is the exact same tool you see painted on the tomb walls of the New Kingdom. Look at the boats. The feluccas that drift silently in the sunset still use the same triangular sail shape that the ancient skiffs used. They still navigate the sandbanks with the same intuitive knowledge of the current. Listen to the language. The Egyptian dialect of Arabic is filled with words that have no root in the desert of Arabia, but come directly from the farms of the pharaohs. When an Egyptian says to mean yes or calls a cat bis, they are echoing the sounds of their ancestors. The river has burned its identity into the DNA of the people. It created a society that values stability over chaos, humor over despair, and community over isolation. There is a famous proverb in Egypt: "He who drinks from the Nile will always return to it." It sounds like a tourist slogan, but it is actually a deep historical truth. The Nile exerts a gravitational pull. It draws people in. It drew the desert tribes to its banks 7,000 years ago. It drew the Greeks, the Romans, the Arabs, the Turks, the French, and the British, and it absorbed them all. The Nile is the ultimate narrator. It is the only witness that was there when the first stone of the first pyramid was laid. It was there when the Library of Alexandria burned. It was there when the Holy Family fled into Egypt for safety. It was there when the tanks rolled across the bridges in the revolutions of the modern era. It has seen gods born and gods die. It has seen the capital city move from Memphis to Thebes, to Alexandria, to Cairo. It has changed its name, its rulers, and its religion, but it has never changed its nature. It remains the thin green line of life in a world of yellow death. As we conclude this journey, imagine the view from a satellite looking down at Africa at night. You see the vast dark emptiness of the Sahara, and cutting through it you see a blazing ribbon of light. It follows the winding path of the water, from the dam in the south to the glittering fan of the delta in the north. That ribbon of light is 100 million people clinging to the same lifeline that saved their ancestors. The gift of the Nile was not just the water or the mud. The true gift was the civilization itself, the idea that if we work together, if we respect the cycle, and if we build for eternity, we can survive anything. The desert is always waiting. The chaos is always trying to creep back in, but the river flows on. The story of the Nile does not have an ending. It only has a current. And as long as that current flows, the story continues.